Hello there, my name is Amanda Ellis and I'd like to welcome you to the Introduction to R workshop. This workshop will be held using two different videos, and so this will be the first of those videos, and in this video we're just going to look at a brief introduction to R and RStudio. Now before we get started, you should have already accessed the Google Drive, and in the Google Drive you should have found two folders, Module 1 and Module 2, as well as an introduction document. You're going to want to go ahead and take each of these folders and the document and copy them into a folder locally onto your computer. To start out with, we're going to look at, again, an introduction to R and RStudio. So if you go down and click the Start button and you look at the different programs on your computer, scrolling down, you should see both R and RStudio. So I'm going to go ahead and open up R just so you can see what it looks like. So this is, if you just open up R, this is what you are going to see. So R is a free software environment for statistical computing and graphics and can be downloaded from the rproject.org. And so everyone should have already downloaded R. There are several advantages to using R, including that the program is freely distributed, the source code is available, and any user can submit code. So this is what R looks like, and as you can see, it's fairly empty. There's not a whole lot to click on up top, and using R this way is not necessarily the most user-friendly. So typically, in order to run our code, instead of running R this way, we use instead RStudio. So let's go on our computer and open RStudio. So here is the RStudio screen. Yours might look a little bit different than mine. I use a black background by default. Yours probably has a white background, and I'll show you how to change that here in just a moment. But this is what RStudio looks like, and so in the background RStudio is going to run R, and so typically when I work with R or the R language, I never actually open up the R window that you saw before. I do everything through RStudio. So RStudio is a free R editor that can be used alongside with R, and you should already have it downloaded on your computer. Now you'll notice in RStudio there are right now 3 different panels, and here in a moment we'll see a 4th panel. And so I'd like to talk about what these different panels are. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the 4th panel. And so if you come up here, you can click File, New File, R Script, and you'll notice a 4th window now opens. So now we're going to talk about these 4 different windows. The first one we're going to look at down here is called the console. The console is a place where you can type R commands line by line. So for example, in the console I could ask R, okay, what is 2 plus 2? And I would hit enter, and R would tell me that that is equal to 4. I could ask R other questions like what's the mean and give it a data set or the standard deviation of a data set, or I could ask it to use plots. But by using the console, I have to type everything in line by line and hit enter afterwards. The problem with working in R this way is it makes it hard to save your work or to write more complicated code. So typically what we will do instead is we will write what are called scripts, and we save them in the script window. This is the script window up here in the upper left-hand corner. So remember that to get this window to appear, I went to File and I created a new file. This is just like when you work with Microsoft Word, when you create a new file and you can type your document. You can think of this window as being the exact same as that, except instead of typing a document, we're now going to type code. Here we have the Workspace and History window. The workspace shows all of the variables currently loaded in RStudio, and right now we haven't really done anything, so there's no variables that have been stored. And then the history gives a list of all of the commands that we've typed. So notice if we click on history here, we see at the very bottom 2 plus 2. The rest of these are things that I've typed in previously, and so what we could do is clear all of those out, and now all of the history is gone. So to see how both of these work, let's now go back to our console. And suppose that I want to say, I'm going to create a variable or we could call it an object, and I'm going to call that object Amanda. I can call it anything that I want to, so you could type your name here. And I'm going to set Amanda equal to 1 plus 2 plus 3. So R is going to know that Amanda is equal to 6. So let's hit enter. Now notice nothing was outputted here. We don't see the number 6, and that's because we've assigned 6 to be equal to Amanda. But if you'll notice, now up here in the global environment, we have Amanda, and we see that it's equal to 6. If we go to the history, we can see what we typed in here. The last window that we haven't talked about yet is the various extra features. So the various extra features, these are different places where you can find help within R, you can look at different packages that have been loaded, any plots that you create, and you can also navigate through the files on your computer. So there's a lot of extra stuff that happens in this bottom right-hand window. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about how R looks visually here. Again, your screen probably has the white background. I like the black one. It makes it easier on my eyes. So I'm going to quickly show you how to change this. If you go up to Tools and then click on Global Options and go down to Appearance, you will notice that there are all different types of things that you can click on down here to have different color schemes. The one that I currently have is Chaos, but you could click any of these, whichever one you like, and then if you hit Apply and OK, it will change the look of your screen. All right, as you're working in R, you might want to, you need some help. You have questions about what different functions or different things do. So there are different help files that are built within R as well as Google that you can call. So for example, let's say that you know a function's name that you want to use, and let's say that function is mean, but you're not sure how to actually use that function. Down here in the console, we could type mean, hit enter, and then information about the mean function will appear down here in the help. If you don't know the name of the function, but you know what it is you want to do, so for example, you want to take the mean of a set of numbers, but you're not sure the name of the function, you can put double question marks in front of what you're looking for. And then again, if we click on enter, and right now it says that no search results were found. This does happen every once in a while depending on your internet connection. So if that happens, it's not a big deal. Generally what I'll do at that point, if the search results in R aren't working properly, is I will go to Google and just search for how to calculate a mean in R, and I would find similar results. All right, so now we're going to talk about how do we actually open up a file and how do we do work in R. So one thing that we're going to want to do is set what is called a working directory. So this specifies the default location for you to read and write files from during a session. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go down here to Files, and we're going to look at how to navigate the files on your computer. So if you click these three little white dots right here in the corner, that's going to pull up all of the files on your computer. Now I have the files for this workshop stored on my Google Drive. You've probably got them stored somewhere else. So what you're going to want to do is navigate through this file explorer and find where you have the files located on your computer. And you want to go to that Module 1 folder. So I'm going to click on Module 1, and you're going to notice that now all of the files located inside of Module 1 are now appearing in R. And for this video, I'm going to be working out of this folder, so I want to set the working directory. So the easiest way to do that, now that I've navigated to this folder on my computer, is I can click on More, Set as Working Directory. And now R knows I'm going to work out of this folder. And you can see down here that R has already automatically generated some code for me. And so this is the code that was actually used to set that working directory. All right, so the next thing I'm going to want to do is let's look at the files that are actually in this folder that we just opened. You'll notice here we have the Module 1 PDF. This is the PDF that you should have open next to you as we go through this video. And then we have module 1.r. This is one of those R scripts that I was talking about. So let's double click it and you'll notice that that script now appears here. And so this is going to be all of the code that we use for this workshop. And you'll notice that the very first bit of code I have here is the code used to setting the working directory. So what I'm going to do is take that code that R generated down here in the console, I'm going to copy it and update my file. Now, if you're ever working and you're curious about what your current working directory is, you can use the function GetWD. So if you highlight the GetWD with your mouse and then go up here and click Run, notice that the code here in the script automatically populated into the console and ran. And it tells me that my current working directory is this folder where we have all of the files. Next, let's look at how to read in some data. So in our folder, we have a data set and it's called practice data. So I'm just going to open it in Excel first to look at it. Right, so here is the practice data. So we've got a couple different columns here. So we've got toy variable 2, group variable, response variable, explanatory variable, and then group variable 2. And so we're going to call these different variables in R here momentarily. But the first thing we need to do is to read this data set into R. So to do that, we're going to use what's called the read.table function. Now you'll notice as you look through my script here that I have several lines of code that have the hashtag in front of them. Any pieces of code that have that symbol in front of them are what we call comments. So comments are there for the reader, and R, they're hidden from R. R doesn't see them. So what you'll notice here is for all of the code that we've included here, I've basically written little notes so that you can go in and change things as you need to. So for example, I'm going to read in some data, and the data I read in, I'm going to name it practice data. You could write whatever you want here. So I could call this Amanda data or test data, whatever you want to call this. The important thing is give it a name that you'll know what that name represents later on. So if you're working with a particular animal or a different particular plant, if I were working with strawberries, for example, I might want to call this strawberry data. But this name is completely up to you. So this is what the data set's going to be called once it's read into R. Now we're going to use the read.table function. So functions are generally, you'll have the function name and then after it you're going to have an open and closed parentheses. So notice the parenthesis opens here and it closes here. Everything in between there, that's the information that you have to give R in order for this function to run. So if I'm going to read in some data, I need to tell R what file I want it to read in. So notice here I've given it the file name. Next, I have to tell it, does the file have a header? And so what we mean by header is if we go back and look at our practice data file, notice that each of our variables have names. So these are the headers. If this data set did not have variable names, then I want header equals false. This particular file is a CSV, which is separated by commas. So I'm telling R that this data set, the different values are separated by commas. And then I have to tell R, okay, when you read this data set in, this is how the missing values were denoted. So again, if we go back to the data set, notice that we have some missing values that are denoted by NA and some missing values that are denoted by blank spaces. So here we have NA.strings. This is how we tell R how we're going to denote the missing variables, and I have it equal to an empty space and the NA. These are some other options that you might want that I haven't included. So if there are comments in your data file, you can tell R, hey, these are comments, you can ignore these. You might want to skip a couple lines before reading in the data. So maybe there's some notes up at the top of the file. Or you may want R to only read in the first 1,000 or 2,000 rows, and this is how you can tell it that. Now to run this, we're going to highlight the entire piece and we're going to click Run. And you'll notice now in my global environment, we now have practice data It has 100 observations and 6 variables. Now, one thing to notice here is if my working my working directory had not been set, R would have given me an error saying it could not find the file. So if R ever gives you that and says, hey, I can't find the file, the very first thing you want to do is check your working directory. The second is to make sure that everything is spelled correctly. R is case sensitive, so in other words, it sees capital letters and lowercase letters differently, so always double check that your capitalization is correct as well as your spelling. So now if we come over here to data and click down, you'll notice here are all of those variables that we saw in Excel. We could also double click on practice data. It will open up here in R, and you'll notice this looks just like it did when we opened it in Excel. There are other ways to read in data. So for example, you could also click on Tools, and then we could go to oops, sorry, I'm in the wrong spot here. Sorry, they have moved it on me here. Here we go. So we don't want, I'll fix this in the PDF. We don't want select tools. We want to go to File, Import Data Set. And then you'll notice there are several different options here from different ways that we could read in data. All right, so our data set has now been read in. Now that our data set has been read in, we can check and see what it looks like. And like I said, we could double click on the practice data here to open it up. We could also run some lines of code to help us. So here's some example lines of code that we could run. Notice that each of these start out with practice data. So in other words, I'm telling R, I want you to go find the object practice data, and I want to look at some different pieces of it. R views the practice data kind of like a matrix. It's stored in rows and it's stored in columns. So we use the square brackets and then a comma in the center. Anything before the comma will be about the rows, and anything after the comma will be about the column. So if I run this line of code, I'm telling R, I want you to print the first 5 rows and all of the columns for this data set. And so notice if we run this, we get the first 5 rows and all of the columns. The second one, I'm telling R, I want you to print out all of the rows, but only the first 2 columns. And notice if we run this, we get all 100 rows, but only the first 2 columns. And so these are different ways that we can visualize our data. Another way is instead of using the numbers that represent the rows or the columns, we could use the variables' names. So for example, maybe I just want to view the explanatory variable. Again, notice before the comma is empty, so this is going to display all of the rows and the explanatory variable. So if we run this, these are all of the rows. Notice there's 100 different observations, but they're all of the values of explanatory variable. Another way to do this, and I'm going to do this down here in the console so you can see, I could type down in the console practice data, and notice before I even finish typing it, R kind of fills that in for me. So if I click up and enter, it'll automatically populate. And it does this, again, because this is in my global environment, and R recognizes that I've created this object practice data. Next, we could type the $, and you'll notice that all 6 variables pop up as options. So I can click the explanatory variable, click enter, and I will get the exact same thing. Next, we can look at how to subset our data. So in order to do this, I'm going to run this line of code, and then we'll talk about what it does. So let's run this. Notice I've created a new object here called practice data 2, and again, this name is completely up to us. So let's look at practice data and practice data 2 compared to one another. So looking at practice data, let's look at the group var 2. So notice the group var 2, the first 25 observations have an A, the next 25 have a B, the next 25 have an A, and the last 25 have a B. Whereas if we look at practice data 2, notice the first 50 observations have an A and the last 50 have a B. And if we come over here and we look at the ordering of the observations, notice we have the numbers 1 through 25, and then we jump from 51 to 75. So in other words, what it has done is it has reordered all of the observations based on group var 2. So coming over here, notice we've called practice data, and we have the square brackets that follow. I have that comma that we're used to, so I'm going to call all of the columns because there's nothing after the comma. But before I have the comma is this piece right here. And what this is doing is it's calling group var 2 and then putting them in order. In other words, all of the A's and then all of the B's. Now, this was for the group var 2. We could do the exact same thing, but for group var, the first one. So to do this, all I'm going to do is copy a line down below, and I'm going to call this practice data 3, and I'm going to put group var instead of group var 2. And so we can run this. So we have practice data 3. Now if we look at practice data, notice that group var has control all the way down, and then we have treatment. So it was really already in order. But if we look at practice data 3, notice it is exactly the same. We have all of the controls and then all of the treatments. So we know, since these are already in order, that observation 51 through 100 is all of the treatments. So if I wanted to subset this data to have one data set that's the treatment data and one data set that's the control data, one thing that I could do is I could say, well, there are 50 observations in each group, so I'm going to set k equal to 50, and there's 100 total observations. So I know that the treatment data is the rows 51 to 100 in my original data set. And then similarly, I know that the control data, I could call the practice data 1 to observation 50 would give me the control data. Now this works because our data set was already in order by that group var variable. But what if it wasn't? If it wasn't, we could use what's called the subset function. So what the subset function is going to do is I'm going to say treatment data. So again, I have control over this name. Now notice we've used the same name twice. You want to be very careful in doing this because once I run this line of code, it's going to overwrite this thing that existed before. So be careful with using the same names because you can overwrite your previous work. What this is going to do is it's going to take the practice data set, and it's only going to include the observations for which group var is equal to treatment. So notice here we have the double equal sign. In R, whenever you're telling R, I want you to do this if this is equal to this, you have to use two equal signs. If you use a single equal sign, that's saying I want you to set this thing to always be equal to this. And then anytime we work with a name or characters, we put them in quotations. So that's why treatment's in quotations here. So let's run this. And we can now look at our treatment data. And notice we have observations 51 through 100, and group var is equal to treatment for all of them. We can do something similar for the control. And notice for the control data, we get the same thing. We now have observations 1 through 50, and all of them are equal to control. Right. You can always check the format of any of your data sets. So we run this, and this is what's called a data frame. R will store data sets or objects different ways. So typically you're going to be working with data frames. You're going to read in, CSVs, and they're going to be data frames. But you do want to be careful because sometimes things can get misclassified, and you might have a matrix or a vector, and that might affect how you're applying the functions. The last thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to take data that is in R and write it to a CSV. So again, we can use the get working directory function to check our current working directory, and that hasn't changed. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is create a new data set. So I'm going to start by taking the log of the response variable, and I'm going to call it response.log. And again, you could use whatever name you want here. So let's run this. Notice we have this new value that pops up, and it is the log of the response variable. Next thing I'm going to do is I am going to combine my original data set with my new variable that I created. So I've called this data to write, and again, anything on the left hand side of the equal sign, that name is up to you. I'm going to create a new data frame. So remember when we checked our class earlier, it was a data frame, so we know we're working with data frames. And what I'm going to do for my new data frame is I just want my new data frame to consist of the explanatory variable for my original data set, the the group variable for my original data set, and the log of the response. So let's run this. Notice I get a new data set up here called data to write, and my new data set just has those 3 columns. So now I could write this data set to my computer. So the first thing I want to do is double check my names. So I can use the call names function to check the name of my columns. And if you'll notice, by default the names are practicedata.expvar, practicedata.groupvar, and rasp.log. Well, I don't really want that practice data piece in front of it, so I can rename it. And this time I'm going to call the column names, but I'm going to set it equal to. Now, this arrow right here, R sees that the same as an equal sign. So you could take this and you could write an equal sign here instead, and it would do the exact same thing. The C, open closed parentheses, this creates a vector. So this vector is just going to have 3 words in it, and these are my 3 new column names. Right? And then, again, if we look at our column names, notice that they have now changed to what I want them to be. And then finally, to write our data to a new CSV file, instead of using the read.table, I'm going to use the write.table function. I'm going to feed it the R data set, data to write, that I want it to write to my computer. The file name is going to be logdata.csv. And then there's some other options here, and I've put comments so you can see what those options are. So let's run this. Okay, and now this has written a file to my computer. So if I go to that folder that we've been working on, notice there is now a new data set called log.data that we could open in Excel if we want to. And if I open it in Excel, you'll notice it has those 3 columns. So this is going to conclude the first video. And again, this is just to get you just started with R and how to read in data, how to write data out. So just the very, very basics. So if you feel a little overwhelmed at this point, that is completely fine. In video 2, we're going to look more at how to make plots and actually do some stuff with the data sets. Now you will notice in the PDF that's in the file folder, there's where to find more information. This workshop is by no means to make you an expert at R. Again, just to give you an idea of what can be done in R and the very basics. If you're interested in learning more about R, there are tons and tons of free sources online and lots of different textbooks, and so I've got a little section there that's about where to find more information if you'd like a book or something else to go through material and actually learn R more fully.